There's a room in a Southern California home that sat untouched for years. Not locked out of neglect, but out of grief. Behind the door, half-finished songs, boxes of concert tapes recorded on stages from Moscow to Rio, and the last unheard ideas of a man many consider the greatest voice heavy metal ever produced. When Ronnie James Dio died in 2010, he didn't leave behind a will written in fine print about who gets the guitars. He left behind a legacy so large that the people managing it are, to this day, still deciding what to do with it. And some of those decisions have split his fan base right down the middle. This is the real story of what happened to Ronnie James Dio's estate. When Ronnie passed away on May 16, 2010, his wife and longtime manager, Wendy Dio, inherited more than a company. She inherited a body of unfinished work that nobody quite knew what to do with. 4 years afterward, Wendy has said in interviews that she couldn't bring herself to sit down and sort through everything in Ronnie's archive. What was actually in there wasn't nothing. According to Wendy, there were at least 3 songs Ronnie had been chipping away at before he died. One written with his old friend and bassist Jimmy Bain, another with guitarist Craig Goldy, and a third with guitarist Doug Aldrich, dating back to sessions for a planned sequel to his 2000 concept album Magica. Aldrich has since said publicly that he still has a demo of an unreleased Dio track sitting on a hard drive, one he describes as haunting, and that he offered it to Wendy years ago without ever hearing back. On top of the songs, there were mountains of live tapes, recordings from decades of touring across multiple continents, some of it barely organized. That kind of silence is unusual for the music industry. Normally, when a major artist dies, a label wants product on shelves within a year or two, finished or not. Wendy took a different approach. She said repeatedly that Ronnie was a perfectionist, and that she wasn't going to release anything with his name on it unless it actually met the standard he held himself to while he was alive. As of the early 2020s, she confirmed the material was finally being catalogued with the help of Wyn Davis, the engineer Ronnie trusted most, with an eye toward eventually releasing some of it as part of a collection of rare and unheard material. Even then, Wendy has been careful to say she's not going to rush a posthumous release just to capitalize on his name. That instinct for restraint over profit is worth sitting with for a second, because it's rare. But the vault wasn't even the biggest question hanging over Ronnie's legacy. The bigger one goes back to before he was famous at all, to a teenager from upstate New York who borrowed his stage name from a man connected to organized crime. Ronnie James Dio wasn't born Dio. He came into the world as Ronald James Padavona on July 10, 1942, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, though his family relocated to Cortland, New York, when he was still a small child. His parents were Italian-American, and his father pushed music on him early, trumpet lessons, then a spot performing in front of audiences by the time he was 5 years old. Before any of the fantasy and mythology persona people associate with him now, Ronnie was actually pointed toward a completely different life. He enrolled at the University at Buffalo with plans to study pharmacology, the kind of stable career path his parents' generation valued. Music kept pulling harder though, and by the tail end of the 1950s he'd made his choice. That's also around when he adopted the name Dio, Italian for God. The inspiration wasn't some grand religious statement. He borrowed it from Johnny Dio, a real mafia-connected figure of that era, simply because the name stuck with him. It's one of the stranger footnotes in metal history. One of the genre's most mystical, otherworldly frontmen picked his stage name off a mob nickname, not a myth. His earliest bands sounded nothing like the music that would eventually define him. Groups like Ronnie and the Redcaps played doo-wop and rockabilly on the small club circuit, a world away from wizards and dragons. It wasn't until he formed the band Elf in the late 1960s that his sound started drifting toward the heavier rock that would carry him for the rest of his career, and that shift caught the attention of a guitarist who was about to change everything. In 1975, former Deep Purple guitarist Ritchie Blackmore recruited Ronnie to front a new project called Rainbow. On paper, it was an odd pairing. Blackmore's classically influenced guitar work against Ronnie's taste for fantasy-driven lyrics, but it worked. Albums like Rainbow Rising and Long Live Rock and Roll turned Rainbow into one of the defining bands of early heavy metal, with Ronnie's operatic range carrying songs that sounded like they'd been pulled from a fantasy novel. The partnership didn't end in one dramatic blow-up. It was more of a slow mismatch. Heading into the album Down to Earth, Blackmore pushed the band toward a more radio-friendly, commercial sound, and Ronnie, whose entire identity as a performer was built on the mythic and the fantastical, didn't fit where Blackmore wanted to take things. By the time Down to Earth was released in 1979, Ronnie was already gone, replaced by a different singer. For most musicians, getting pushed out of a band mid-shift would be where the story quietly ends. For Ronnie, it turned out to be the beginning of the biggest opportunity of his career. Later in 1979, Ronnie joined Black Sabbath, stepping into the frontman role vacated by Ozzy Osbourne. At the time, this looked like a job built to fail. Ozzy wasn't just Sabbath's singer. To a lot of fans, he was the band's identity. Replacing him seemed almost impossible. Instead, Ronnie helped reinvent what Black Sabbath sounded like. Heaven and Hell in 1980 and Mob Rules in 1981 gave the band a genuine second creative peak, and both albums are still regularly ranked among the strongest works Sabbath ever produced, Ozzy era included. The mythological, fantasy-steeped lyrical style that hadn't fit Blackmore's new commercial direction turned out to be exactly what Sabbath needed. It was also during this period that Ronnie popularized the devil horns hand gesture, now recognized at metal shows worldwide. By his own account, he picked it up from his Italian grandmother, who used it as an old-world superstition to ward off the evil eye. He brought it on stage, and it spread across the entire genre, eventually becoming one of the most universally recognized symbols in heavy metal, understood by fans regardless of what language they speak. Given how well things were going, you might expect that lineup to have lasted for years. It didn't. Ronnie's first exit from Black Sabbath, in 1982, came down to a dispute over how a live album was going to be mixed. He and drummer Vini Appice felt their contributions weren't being represented fairly, and rather than compromise, both of them walked. Ronnie went on to form his own band, simply called Dio, and released Holy Diver in 1983 to major solo success. That wasn't the last attempt to reunite with Sabbath. In 1992, Ronnie rejoined the band for an album called Dehumanizer, but the same old tensions resurfaced almost immediately, and the reunion produced exactly one record before falling apart again. It did leave behind one strange bit of pop culture trivia. A leftover track from those sessions, Time Machine, ended up on the soundtrack to the comedy film Wayne's World. The third attempt looked more durable. In 2006, Ronnie reunited again with Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Vini Appice, this time performing under the name Heaven and Hell specifically to distinguish the lineup from the Ozzy-fronted version of Sabbath. They recorded new material for a compilation and, in 2009, released a full studio album, The Devil You Know, their first complete record together in decades, and one that was met with strong reviews. It was during the tour supporting that album that something started going seriously wrong with Ronnie's health, even if nobody around him fully understood it yet. By his bandmates' accounts, Ronnie was in real pain some nights on that tour, dealing with it privately and still performing full sets. He and Wendy had already consulted a specialist about ongoing digestive issues before the tour began, and at the time, the tests came back clear. So the tour continued, all the way to what would turn out to be his final concert, on August 29, 2009, in Atlantic City. Just months later, in November 2009, Ronnie was diagnosed with stomach cancer. The first public statement described it as an early-stage diagnosis, and treatment began right away at the Mayo Clinic. The reality, according to bandmate Geezer Butler, was harsher. By the time doctors caught it, the cancer had already progressed to stage 4 and was inoperable. Ronnie moved to MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston for aggressive chemotherapy, while continuing to speak publicly about beating the disease. In April 2010, he made his final public appearance, showing up in person to accept the award for Best Metal Singer at the Revolver Golden Gods Awards, an appearance that gave a lot of fans real hope he might pull through. He didn't. Ronnie James Dio died on May 16, 2010, at 67 years old. That should have been the end of the story. In a lot of ways, it was only the start of a far more complicated one, because deciding what to do with everything Ronnie left behind turned out to be its own long, sometimes controversial process. After Ronnie's death, Wendy took over full control of his legacy, continuing to run Niji Entertainment, the label and management company the two of them had built together. One of her first major moves was establishing the Ronnie James Dio Stand Up and Shout Cancer Fund, which has since raised millions of dollars for cancer research and awareness through recurring fundraising events like Ride for Ronnie and Bowl for Ronnie, events that continue to draw musicians and fans together every year. A tribute album followed years later, featuring artists like Metallica and Rob Halford covering Ronnie's songs, with proceeds funneled back into the same cause. This part of the estate's handling has been largely uncontroversial. The part that split fans came next. In 2016, a Los Angeles production company called Illusion, working with Wendy's blessing, built a hologram of Ronnie and debuted it in front of more than 75,000 people at Germany's Wacken Open Air Festival. A short European tour followed in 2017, and by 2019, a reworked, higher-quality version of the hologram went out on a full U.S. tour called Dio Returns, performing alongside a live band made up of former Dio and Sabbath musicians, using isolated vocal tracks pulled from Ronnie's actual performances rather than any synthesized voice. The reaction was brutal in places. The British metal publication Kerrang published a piece calling the entire project a travesty and arguing it needed to stop, describing the hologram as an unnecessary and unsettling substitute for the real thing. Even musicians who'd worked closely with Ronnie were split. Former Dio guitarist Doug Aldrich later said in an interview that he thought Ronnie himself would have been pissed about the idea, even while admitting he was still curious to see it. Wendy defended the project at the time, arguing it was a heartfelt tribute and that the people who actually attended the shows loved it. Illusion's CEO made a similar case publicly, framing the criticism as coming from people who hadn't actually seen the show. But years later, Wendy was candid about the financial reality. The hologram reportedly cost well over $2 million to build, and by her own admission, that money was never fully recouped. Eventually, Wendy pulled the plug on future hologram tours altogether. In interviews since, she's described the whole project as an experiment she doesn't want to repeat, saying that after watching it evolve over a few versions, she ultimately decided she wanted real Ronnie, not a projection. In place of a hologram, she shifted toward using restored concert film of Ronnie from old multi-camera recordings, paired with special effects and a live band, working with his longtime lighting and stage designer to build something she feels connects with fans more honestly than a digital projection can. The hologram wasn't the only piece of Ronnie's legacy to resurface unexpectedly. Old, previously unheard live recordings have periodically been pulled from the archive and released years after they were originally performed, giving longtime fans new pieces of his catalog decades on. In July 2021, Wendy and journalist Mick Wall released a posthumous autobiography, Rainbow in the Dark, built from notes and material Ronnie had started compiling himself before his death, with Wendy filling in gaps and offering her own perspective throughout. The book covers his life up through the mid-1980s. A year later, in 2022, an authorized documentary called Dio, Dreamers Never Die premiered at the South by Southwest Film Festival, carrying his story all the way through to the end of his life, featuring interviews with artists like Rob Halford, Lita Ford, and Jack Black. Wendy has described watching the finished film for the first time as an overwhelming, emotional experience. Ronnie's inner circle outside the spotlight has also come into sharper focus in the years since his death. Wendy has spoken about his close friendships with Judas Priest's Rob Halford and Motorhead's Lemmy Kilmister, two other iconic metal frontmen who, by all accounts, were just as selective about who they let in personally as Ronnie was. That friendship with Lemmy ran deep enough that Wendy was reportedly with him just hours before he himself passed away in 2015. As for the unreleased songs still sitting in the vault, the tracks with Jimmy Bain, Craig Goldy, and Doug Aldrich, Wendy has confirmed the material is finally being properly catalogued and that at least one track, the Doug Aldrich collaboration from the Magica 2 sessions, is intended for release as part of a broader collection of rare and previously unheard Dio material. She's been consistent on one point throughout. Nothing gets released just because Ronnie's name is attached to it. It has to sound like something he would have actually approved of. Between a vault that stayed sealed for years, a hologram experiment that divided his own fan base, and a steady stream of books, documentaries, and rare recordings still surfacing more than a decade after his death, one thing is clear. Ronnie James Dio's story didn't end in May of 2010. It's still being written by the people who loved him most, one careful decision at a time. So now that the hologram era is officially over, and there are still real, unfinished Dio songs sitting in that vault, what do you think should happen to the music Ronnie never got to finish? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.